exciting couple of days on news from vaccines for the COVID-19 and rollout plans in large countries around the world. In the latest, the United Kingdom gave an emergency approval to the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine, and it's expected to be available for vaccination as early as next week. Russia was not far behind in saying that they would start mass vaccinations of the Sputnik COVID-19 vaccine in just about a week. The United States plans to roll out its vaccination program towards the end of this year. In fact, they expect 20 million people to be vaccinated just at the end of 2020. What about India? What about our plans? And what is the view on mankind's race towards a vaccine in a very shortened time? To speak on all of this, I'm happy to have on the show today with me Dr. Gagandeep Kang. She is a foremost scientist in infectious disease, a researcher, and has looked at the process of vaccinations for decades, really, and she's a professor right now at the Christian Medical College in Vellore. Dr. Kang, thank you so much for speaking with us here at ET Now. I want to begin by getting your view on the news coming from the Pfizer-BioNTech emergency approval in the United Kingdom and the rollout from next week. It's fascinating that the whole process for Pfizer-BioNTech has taken just about 10 months. Is that highly unusual? How do you look at that development?
I think it's fantastic. So if we look at where we were in January, when we had first identified that this infectious agent of the mystery pneumonia was a coronavirus, and then in 10 days we had the sequence of that coronavirus as well, to now be in a stage where we have had readouts from multiple phase 3 trials, and we have the first trial that has resulted in a vaccine being approved for use. That is absolutely fantastic. I thought I was being very optimistic at the start when vaccination and vaccine programs got started, in saying that it would take 12 to 18 months to develop a vaccine. If we were optimistic, we could have a vaccine sometime in 2021. So to have a vaccine at the end of 2020 is really phenomenal. And it speaks to what scientists and industry can do when everybody works together and works really, really hard. I think a lot of people haven't slept for months.
Wow. Dr. Kang, how do you look at the plans that large countries have had to ensure that they have a very quick vaccination rollout? So I talked about Russia, the US, UK, of course. China has had some kind of a vaccination rollout as well. And how do you compare this with India's plan, really, on a policy level to ensure vaccination? We seem to be focusing on indigenous production of vaccines.
Well, Russia and China kind of jumped the gun when it came to use of vaccines. It's very important that people trust vaccines because they understand the process by which vaccines are developed, and understand that because of that process, vaccines are safe and efficacious. China and Russia decided to go ahead with permitting widespread limited use of the vaccines without having followed that process. When the Gamaleya vaccine was given its certification, as it was called, that was actually based on 39 people having received the vaccine. And those kinds of approaches create doubts. What we are doing in India and what has been done in the UK, the US, and many other countries in developing vaccines is following what is a tried and tested pathway to the development of vaccines, where you start with small trials, but you don't actually begin widespread use of the vaccine until you are confident that this vaccine will prevent disease by testing it in large numbers of people in phase 3 trials. This is exactly what was done with Moderna, with Pfizer, BioNTech, what has been done with the AstraZeneca University of Oxford collaboration, what is being done in India with the Covaxin vaccine with Bharat Biotech. Now, where other Indian candidates are concerned, for some of them, we are going to bridge to data that is available from the West. AstraZeneca Serum Institute is one such vaccine, but that vaccine also is being evaluated in limited trials in the country so that we have an adequate data package for regulators to review. Now, when we think about the rush to start vaccination programs and get things going, let's take a look at what the situation is in the UK and the US compared to that in India. Both of them are facing an onslaught of cases that is worse than what they saw previously. And for them, vaccination is very, very important in order to be able to arrest this rising tide of cases that they are seeing and make sure that their most vulnerable are protected. So, if you look at what has been prioritized as groups there, you'll see that the elderly come almost front and center after healthcare workers, sometimes before healthcare workers. Now, I think that's really important because this is where they are seeing the burden of disease. In the US, in the UK, the highest mortality is in homes that care for the elderly. We don't have such structures in India. We don't have an elderly population that is the same proportion in India because our population is younger. We are also seeing lower mortality rates in India. So while I understand their rush to vaccinate, I'm not at all worried if in India we wait for products that are suitable for our system to use. So I think what the government is doing, making preparatory plans at this time, is the right way to go. Perhaps a little more detail on these plans will be forthcoming in the next few days. We hear about many things that are being discussed by government, statements that are made. But I think we've handled the pandemic quite well without vaccines so far. So we should not be in a rush to get vaccines out there. We should prepare and do it well because once we start, this is going to be a really long, really large, ongoing effort for a year or more.
Dr. Kang, you are very familiar and well versed with India's capabilities to vaccinate. This, what we will undertake in the year to come, will be unprecedented at this scale and size. Do you think we have the systems in place? We have a very successful polio immunization program, for example, but adult vaccination at this scale, what are the challenges you see ahead for us?
Let's be very clear that no country has adult immunization programs on this scale. Many countries have adult immunization programs. They give influenza vaccine on a regular basis to as much of their populations as they can reach, and that is commendable. They have approaches to getting adult vaccines out there. But even when those vaccines are available, they are not taken by everyone, they are not given to everyone. So around the world, the level of adult immunization that we are talking about now is larger than it has ever been before. For countries like India that have not had a serious adult immunization program, other than the doses of tetanus toxoid or TD vaccine that are given in pregnancy, this is, of course, going to be a very significant challenge. And given that in India, our population is so large, it's going to be an enormous challenge to get the vaccine to all people who need it wherever they might live. And we have a lot of remote locations as well. Now, the question about can we do it? If we put our minds to it, if we work at it, there is nothing that cannot be done if you have the right people and the right resources in place. The government is planning for all of this, but do we have a system in place today? No, we don't. Nor does anybody else.
Dr. Kang, I want your assessment of the Indian candidates for the vaccine so far. The ones in the limelight, of course, are the three where the Prime Minister visited a few days ago, which is Zydus Cadila, Bharat Biotech, and the Serum Institute, which is developing the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Generally, people believe that the SII Oxford vaccine is the safest and clearest bet for us. What is your assessment of these candidates and other Indian candidates?
So I think you don't know about a candidate until it has been reviewed by a regulator. And that only comes when you have a complete data package available. All vaccines have a very high safety bar, which is why when you test vaccines, you test them in increasing numbers of people through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And then you continue to monitor the safety of those vaccines once they are in the program. It's also important that vaccines are not only safe, but they are efficacious. And efficacy can only be measured in phase 3 clinical trials that have disease as an outcome. You can also have other outcomes, but disease must be your primary outcome that you look at. And for all the vaccines that are in clinical trials, that is what they are doing. But when you say that we are measuring disease as an outcome, the clinical trial protocol can actually change what you measure and how you measure it. So if you say RT-PCR plus one symptom versus saying RT-PCR plus a respiratory symptom, those can result in different outcomes in different clinical trials. Because you could have loss of taste, loss of smell, fever, as well as RT-PCR positivity without necessarily having a respiratory symptom. Which means that when we see results of clinical trials that say 90%, 95%, 70%, we actually cannot treat that as a head-to-head comparison of the products so that we rank products 1, 2, 3. So in what WHO is proposing, aligned with their Solidarity drug trial, which was published today in the New England Journal of Medicine, they are proposing a Solidarity vaccine trial that will test multiple vaccines with one control arm, which means that we will actually wind up with potentially head-to-head comparisons of vaccines. But right now, that head-to-head comparison doesn't exist. So what data can we use? We can use the published efficacy data, none of which has been published as yet, but hopefully will be soon. And we can use the suitability of that vaccine for our program to make decisions. When a government needs to make a decision about whether to introduce a vaccine or which vaccine to choose, there are three factors that are very important. One is there sufficient disease to make it worth our while to introduce the vaccine? And the answer to that, obviously, yes, there is sufficient disease. The second is the vaccine working? And the regulatory process and the publications will tell us that the vaccines that we are considering are working, because otherwise we wouldn't be using them. But the third and very important component is the system ready for this vaccination? And if the vaccination program is then held to a standard or is required to have a standard that is not available, for example, -70 storage, then obviously the program is not ready to deliver that vaccine. So all three factors must be considered when a decision is made about vaccination.
I'm going to ask you a few questions, Dr. Kang, which are, I would say, FAQs that lay people really have in mind right now. And one of them clearly is that, are these vaccines safe, considering that they haven't completed all their phases of trial, that the ones which are being given out are emergency use approval vaccines? Is there enough data there to rule out any possible side effects?
So, if you look at the clinical trial protocols that were published for AstraZeneca, for Pfizer BioNTech, for Moderna, of the two, Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech have gone for emergency use authorization. But they've gone for emergency use authorization with more data than they needed for their phase 3 clinical trial. They needed to have 150 and 160 cases, and they are way over that. Right? So when you have more data than you had originally planned to have, that actually makes the results of your trial stronger in terms of your confidence intervals. The estimates that you have made are actually more accurate. Now, why go for an emergency use authorization instead of going for a full licensure? It's the paperwork. So if you look at the paperwork requirements for an emergency use authorization, they are more limited than for what is called a full BLA. Okay? And I have no doubt that all the data that has been accumulated, this is kind of fresh, hot off the press, that they have announced in their press releases, but they will be taking that data, putting it into a package, first for an emergency use authorization, and then converting that into a full BLA application. This will take time. It can take months, especially if you're going to incorporate additional immunological assays. Then it may take several months for them to be able to collate the data. Now, when we look at immunological outcomes, defining subgroups, clinical outcomes, that can take a while. But the coding of safety within a clinical trial is actually done fairly rapidly. And in a placebo-controlled trial, you will be looking at safety events in the vaccinated group and safety events in the placebo group. What you are looking to see is that the vaccinated group should not have certain kinds of safety events that are greater than what is seen in the placebo group. And this kind of determination will be done very, very quickly now that the trials have been unblinded, and these data will need to be submitted to the regulator. The regulators had a requirement that you would need data on safety for at least half of the people in the trial for at least 2 months. And this is appropriate because 90 to 95% of any safety events that are going to happen in any clinical trial will happen in the first 6 weeks after vaccination. So if there are very, very rare safety events,
Okay.
or if there are very long-term safety events, those will not be measured in any case in the phase 3 clinical trial. So if something happens 5 years after the trial is over, then you're not going to be able to catch that in any phase 3 clinical trial. If anything happens in 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million people who are vaccinated, again, you're not going to be able to catch that in a clinical trial. Take the example of polio. Oral polio vaccine has been responsible for pretty much controlling polio the world over. We are thinking about eradication because of appropriate use of polio vaccines. But in 1 in a couple of million children who receive the polio vaccine, you get vaccine associated paralytic poliomyelitis. The vaccine itself causes the disease that it's supposed to prevent. Yet we continue to use the vaccine, recognizing that there may be a small, rare safety issue with that vaccine. In fact, one of the biggest news of November was that we actually have a new, safer polio vaccine that people have spent a decade working on to eliminate even this small risk of polio vaccine associated disease.
One more question, ma'am, and I'll make this my last one, that people are wondering, do they need to get the vaccine? If you are not in that vulnerable category of elderly or with comorbidities, etc., or a frontline worker, does everyone have to get the COVID-19 vaccine for the disease to truly be eradicated? How does one make that choice, assuming that vaccination will be voluntary?
So disease eradication is a far and future target at the moment, but you get a vaccine for two reasons. One is you get a vaccine to protect yourself against disease, and that is an individual choice that you can make, deciding that, I don't want to be protected against this disease. I have questions, and that's valid. Now, the other reason that you get protected is because vaccination is a public good. The fact that you are vaccinated means that you will not transmit disease to others. Now, do these vaccines prevent transmission? Certainly, in terms of reducing the number of people who potentially get ill in a population and therefore can transmit, yes, it's likely that they will at the population level. So, can a government order you to be vaccinated? In some places like Australia, they are thinking about that. I think that vaccination can and should be treated as a public good. No one should be forced to be vaccinated, but you should make up your mind after really understanding the facts about vaccine development, what it means for you, what it means for your family, and what it means for your community.
Well, I hope this interview would have helped in people and viewers making up their mind and getting much more information. Thank you so much, Dr. Kang. Pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.